Everyone, we're going to continue our discussion of migration with our next essential question for 2.7 of how have migration patterns in the U.S. changed over time. So we're going to be looking at the origins of the people coming to the United States. And we're also going to be looking at some of the internal migration in the United States. So migration in general, the reason why we talk about this relative to the U.S. is in AP we were looking a lot at how the migration patterns, the historical migration patterns, help explain the cultural and regional differences in the United States because it really has many of those differences have their heart and their core in who came and when they came and why they came. So in general, there are three major waves of migration in U.S. history according to AP Human Geography. Our first is going to be considered the colonial era, the second would be the 19th and 20th century, and the third is the late 20th century. Now, the history teacher in me wants to make sure sometimes we get this concept of the centuries mixed up, so please remember that the first century would be the years 0 to 99, right, 100 years. So therefore, the second century starts with the number 1. So a quick little way to remember that, the century, if I say the 19th century, the 19th set of 100 years, go back 1. 19th century is the 1800s. 20th century is the 1900s, right? So that's just a little trick to help you remember those characteristics. So let's start off with the first wave. So I'm going to talk to you, break each one of these down as the dates, who came, and why they came. So the first wave of U.S. migration would be considered from 1607 to 1776. The groups of people who were coming during that period of time, this is when the United States is being settled. So the first groups are the Europeans, of course, primarily the British, who took over in western part of the United States, but also the Spanish and the French, and we'll talk about that in a second. And the majority then, of course, would be then the British and then the enslaved Africans who were coming as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, why were they coming? The British settlers were coming. Some of them, you can see in the map at the top right, that there were different groups of people coming from different places within Europe. Many of the British settlers, some of the general European settlers were coming as a result of religious persecution against Protestants. So Protestants and Catholics actually in different areas of Europe are coming for religious freedom. So we've got people like the Puritans coming, certain Catholic groups coming out of Europe, out of England. So I really should say religious persecution against Protestants and Catholics, and just different groups of people at different times. And of course, the horrific forced migration of the enslaved Africans, primarily out of North and West Africa, coming to the United States. So what you can see, though, is immediately we have a pattern that emerged. The bottom left is the current ethnic distribution in the United States, and you can see that the yellow that's on the bottom left there is displaying the African American population. That has its historical origins in the fact that the enslaved Africans were taken to the South, where there was primarily plantation slavery. So we have the connection between immediately, right, from that colonial period of time. We're going to continue to trace that as we move forward in time. Now, the second wave is a very broad one, so I'm going to break it down, relatively speaking, by decades. So the second wave of U.S. migration began in the 1840s through the 1850s. And the people coming in the the 1900s through 1800s through 1900s is the second wave, but the beginning of that period of time, the first notable change, is in that pre-Civil War era of the 1840s to 1850s. And the groups of people who were coming then were from North and West Europe, and they're specifically coming from Ireland and Germany. These are the largest, even in current day, many Americans have Irish and German heritage. These were some of the largest groups that comprise the immigrant population in the 1840s, and then their descendants remain to this day. Why were they coming? A massive number of people came from Ireland as a result of the Irish potato famine. So the loss of the potato crop, that staple crop, and then in turn led to widespread famine in Ireland. And then many of those people settled in the northeastern part of the United States. So if you look back at that map here, the Irish is in green, the dark green, and you can see on the map, I'll highlight it here, that historical origin of people migrating from Ireland coming to the northeastern part of the United States. In modern day, areas like Boston, areas like New York, have very strong Irish. To this day, there's a very strong concentration of Irish descendants and Irish people who have Irish heritage. People coming from Germany, they're some of the first, and I'm actually going to go forward to a map for just a second. This is the diffusion of the Industrial Revolution, where it went over time, and you can see that when it went from initially from England, moving into Western Europe first. This map of how the Industrial Revolution diffused over time helps us understand both the internal migration in the United States and the global migration to the United States. So that's significant, and we'll come back to that. On that note, many of the people coming from Germany were coming because as Germany began to experience the Industrial Revolution, that meant that there was not as great of a need for jobs. That what was once the work of 10 people could now be done with one with a single machine. So that consolidation, that bringing together of jobs, the collapsing of jobs in that way, meant that people needed to find work. So many people began leaving, beginning with the Germans here in the 1840s and 50s, and moving to the United States. And now, going back to that modern day map, people of German heritage tend to settle in the Midwestern regions, right? So in this larger region. Of course, now this map is a generalization. I also want to be careful on that people aren't using this as sort of law here. But Germans tended to settle in the Midwestern regions, and we still see many of that heritage remain to this day. 1860s in the United States was a civil war, so not a lot of people trying to come to a country in war with itself. So migration was very low in the 1860s. In the post-Civil War era of the 1870s and 1880s, many of the, as we come back to that map of the Industrial Revolution, as you see the Industrial Revolution diffuse into these northern Scandinavian countries in the 1860s, which is that period of time of the Civil War. So by the 1870s and 80s, many of those Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, these northern European countries, here's England, United Kingdom, as the Industrial Revolution diffused there, many of those people began emigrating to the United States. Early 1990s, we're still in that second wave of migration, 1990s, 1900s. The shift then begins to go to, rather than northern European migrants, we have southern and eastern European migrants, primarily from Italy. Now we start to have some cultural clashes here because many of these groups are now starting to compete for jobs, even within the United States. The Industrial Revolution means that there's factory work, so people are moving we have the large-scale urbanization happening in the United States, people moving from the rural areas to the cities. But we start to see some cultural conflicts emerging. Irish versus the Italians versus the Germans versus Polish. There's a lot of these ethnic enclaves, these little groups of people, the groups of communities emerging within cities, and that starts to be experienced here. There's also some unrest, some political unrest in Italy in the 1860s, the unification of Italy, that led to some of the emigration as well. By the 1910s, and they should say the 1920s, we have Hungary and Russia. We see an emergence of migrants coming from these regions. We have the Russian Revolution being experienced, and many of the change in leadership that occurred there led to many people seeking a different way of life, avoiding, later on in time, avoiding communism in the 1990s, 1919. Okay, so then that brings us, we're doing a huge skip in time, right? So we just left off about the 1920s. The first things began to change in the 1950s and really started to kick off again in the 1970s. And this is that third wave. And the third wave of migration. The next component here, because as I mentioned, it's the late 19th century, 20th century. So now we are here in our third wave of the 1970s, going all the way really through present day. By the 1970s, we see a shift, and that shift is now that the large group who's coming are going to be Asians, and specifically we're looking at people coming from China, people coming from the southeastern regions of Asia. We have areas experiencing communist revolutions, and many people looking to emigrate away from these new communist rule. So you can see if you look at the years, the decades, the 1960s, you can see that Asia is only 11%, and by 1970s it's already up to 33%, and continuing to the modern day numbers, there's a little out of date, but 34% there. So we see a big influx in number of people coming from Asia. Also relevant to this would be in more modern times, the growth, the population growth in India also contributes to a large-scale emigration of people looking for better economic opportunity and better educational opportunities. By the 1980s, we have a very big shift, and you can see that back in the 1960s, the number of people coming from Latin America was only 40%. The changes that many of the developing nations of Latin America that they're experiencing are leading to greater wealth for some, so that means that they have better ability to move. But many people are seeking economic opportunity coming from Central and South America. Now, one thing to note is when there's a massive emigration of people from Mexico to the United States, but many of those people are not necessarily coming directly from Mexico. Many of those people have made their way through South America or through Central America to Mexico, and then in turn just simply cross the border into the United States. This, of course, is a contentious issue, the idea of legal immigration versus undocumented immigration, and we'll talk about that in relation to U.S. Immigration policy soon. But this large-scale emigration from the developing world of the Central of Latin America on the whole is truly one of the current defining migration patterns or migration streams. And largely that's going to be a result of just looking for economic opportunities that are both perceived, so what people think they can get in the United States, or perhaps even real. So sometimes there's the real economic opportunities or the opportunities that people feel they may have when they come to the United States. So that's our large-scale migration patterns. Now let's take a step back and look at some of the internal migration patterns. So that's the people coming, the immigration, and now we're looking at internal migration patterns of the United States. Since the creation of the U.S., or even before when the United States was still 13 colonies, the internal migration of the U.S., we've seen a pattern where the quote-unquote center of U.S. population is moving steadily westward and southward. In other words, sort of like the average of where people live. If we were going to consider our population where it's distributed, the average that the center, the average, kind of like the forces working together, and if we're looking at the total distribution, the center of U.S. population is moving steadily westward and southward. And then you can just a blown up version of that map right here. Okay. And what I mean by that is that, or why that's happening, I guess we should start off first of all, is because historically speaking, as people began to settle, when the United States became its independent country and gained independence, first the population began to just simply take over more land. They wanted access to the fur trade in the Ohio River Valley. They wanted the Native Americans to be off that land. So we see pressures that existed from the get-go of the original colonists. But really what began to get that major movement and why people began to settle in the western regions was also because of this concept of manifest destiny, something that those of you who've taken U.S. history are very familiar with, which is the idea that it was the United States' quote-unquote destiny to expand and conquer the savages of the West, and the land from sea to shining sea should be the exclusive rights under control of the United States. So that largely explains many of the reasons why, or that's the philosophical reason why people began moving westward. In reality, some of the other contributing factors, there's much cheaper land. There are many incentives. The Homestead Act, 1862, a lot of different policies that helped encourage U.S. settlement in the western regions for cheaper land. With the technological advantages of canals and railroads, that the transportation options were now improved, so people could now, it was no longer just that people foraging out on their own with their wagon and their family. There's now transportation to link the United States from the west to the east. So that truly brought in more expansion in. In the 1840s, the California Gold Rush, the discovery of gold in California, caused massive immigration, particularly from people from Asia coming into California. So we see, in turn, again, the population continually moving westward. In modern day, I'll come back to that map, I'm sorry. In modern day, the current migration trend and the current internal migration that's helping us understand why the population is moving westward and southward is this relationship between what we call the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt. So the current pattern is people moving out of this Rust Belt region, which you see highlighted here, to the Sun Belt region. And the reason for this is that the Rust Belt was this area of historical manufacturing center. So this is where we have, from a natural resources perspective, there was a lot of coal mines in this region. There were rivers for transportation. This is the area where many of the initial factories were set up. Specifically, we're talking about car manufacturing. So this is the areas where Henry Ford set up his manufacturing centers in Detroit. And these are the areas that in modern day are losing jobs on a massive scale. And people are emigrating out of the Rust Belt and moving to the Sun Belt. So historically, again, what's causing that westward shift is going to be the manifest destiny, cheaper land, California Gold Rush, so on and so forth. In modern day, what's continuing to contribute to that is the emigration of people out of the Rust Belt into the Sun Belt. So pushing them out, the push factors there, of course, are the, well, actually, let me talk about the push factors real quickly. Here, this is the reason why, and I'll come back to that. We have that net out migration because that northern Midwestern region was the former hub, but now what's happening is that this area is experiencing deindustrialization, which is the loss of the primary region. When a city deindustrializes, the basis of their whole economy is being lost. And the basis of their economy is being lost because of outsourcing. The areas you can see, automotive, the metals, many of these factory jobs are being pushed overseas where there's cheaper labor. That's what outsourcing is called. So as companies move to other places in order to get cheaper labor, so they're not manufacturing things within the U.S., that means that the people of these places are left, they're deindustrialized, they're left without the key economic force for that city. And so that's why this area is called the Rust Belt, that what was once these thriving factories are quote unquote rusting, right? We'll return to that when we talk about our economic unit, but that's laying the groundwork. And that means that those are the push factors for the Rust Belt. The pull factors pulling people into the Sun Belt are this is a very climate, the environmental factors that's very attractive for many retirees. Then sometimes the cost of living is cheaper in the Sun Belt than it is in some of the more expensive cities of the Northeast, or say the San Francisco or San Diego in the Southwest. San Francisco in the north of California, and then San Diego in the Southwest. It's also attracting the I already mentioned that retirees. We got technology that many of the technological companies are moving to the areas of the Sunbelt. And I'm sorry, that seemed misleading what I just said there. The Sunbelt is cheaper than many of the northeastern cities. People are moving to places that are less expensive. I'm sorry, that was confusing there. Another big shift is after World War II, many defense contractors began moving people who make weapons or who support the United States government. Many of those factories moved to the south, in turn drawing a lot of jobs down to the south. Manufacturing centers are also moving to the south to take advantage of union-free areas. So if there's no union for the workers in the south, then which is true on the whole, then that means the companies don't have as many regulations that they face, and they can, in turn, that's more profitable for them, even if it's not helpful for the workers. So the Sun Belt is attracting massive growth in population for the United States, and then while the Rust Belt is losing a lot of jobs and losing a lot of people as a result of that. So we will return to the migration policies, and don't worry about that last slide. Here are your analysis questions. I'm just looking at a summary of how the Industrial Revolution affected migration to the United States. What are the primary push and pull factors, just on the whole? And then for question number 3, this is the map I'm referring to, so you can rewind for a little bit. This map right here is the... Oops, too far, sorry guys. This one right here is the map that helps explain... Oh my goodness. Holy moly. Almost there. This map right here helps explain the current ethnic distributions in the United States. This is the one from the AP Human Geography textbook. So this is the one that we'll be using for you to conduct your analysis in question number 3. All right, guys, that's it. Please make sure you have this ready to roll. And next flip video, we'll start looking at the migration policies of the United States.